The Woo Woo Hour.
Hello! Welcome to the Woo Woo Hour again, where we talk all things kitchen witchery, herb and health and wellness tips, and just general witchy stuff. Today we are going to be talking about some questions that folks asked me when I posted something on my Instagram story last week, asking what suggestions people had for videos or anything that folks wanted to have me talk a little bit more about. All of the topics that I was asked are all pretty different across the board, which I love. So I'm going to be making a few videos, hopefully to address some of those questions. So you can look for those on my Instagram posts, on my highlights, and figure out which topic might be appealing to you. And that's what we'll be doing kind of for this second Woo Woo Hour episode. Next time we'll probably be talking a little bit more about herbs in general. But today we'll talk about these questions. So the first topic that I'm going to be talking about is the very brief and general history of witches and witchcraft. It is a very, very complex topic, and there's not a lot of well-documented, unbiased, and factual work about witches or witchcraft at large. So I'm going to be relying on some of the things that I know, as well as two really great books that I would suggest folks to read, which is where I'm getting most of what I'm sharing here. It is not going to be quote by quote from these books. I'm just kind of sharing from what I wrote down or remember from reading these books, and I would definitely recommend checking them out if you want to know more about the history of witches, as well as the history of healers and midwives, as you'll see as I mentioned in one of the books here. So the two books that I'm going to be talking about that I would really recommend, the first one I don't really have on me, but it's called Waking the Witch by Pam Grossman. It is a phenomenal read that talks not only about the history of witches, it also talks about the modern day witch and what that means for many folks today. It talks about also patriarchy, political movements, and a lot of feminist icons as well in the book. Pam Grossman does a really good job overall talking about just the archetype of the witch and what it has meant throughout all of history. So I would definitely check it out. The second book that I really love is this one, Witches, Midwives, and Nurses by Barbara, I'm not going to pronounce it correctly, right? Ehrenreich and Deirdre English. And I believe that both of them have written several other books, but this is one that I would really suggest to folks, that I found really helpful, talking about just a general overview of what it's been like to be a woman who is helping her community as a healer, as a medicine person, as a midwife, as a doula, whatever it may be, and some of the obvious barriers they've come up against in history, and yeah, what that might have looked like around the time of the witch hunts as well. So that's kind of some of the things I'm going to be basing this knowledge off of and roughly quoting from. Yeah, so we'll just kind of begin.
The witch hunts of Europe and America.
So, one of the first starting points for the history of witches and witchcraft, typically most people start at the witch hunts in Europe, which happened possibly between the 1300s to 1600s. And during that time there was possibly between 40,000 to 200,000 people who were executed for being accused of being witches. That's a really large range. That just shows how little of accurate documentation there was. Of course, it was a really long time ago as well. And there's a lot of biased accounts of what was going on. What the European witch hunts, as I guess I'll call them, kind of looked like was when there was a large amount of power in the hands of the Catholic Church, and they were trying to have greater influence and greater power within the countries and regions that they were working in, and they wanted to kind of make other spiritualities, magic, other mystics seem like invalid, and that they were doing bad work, that they were hurting people or teaching the wrong thing. And so what happened is folks who were accused of being witches obviously were executed, were interrogated, and were driven out of the places that they were living at the time. From this book, and also from Waking the Witch, it does talk a lot about how these women, in fact, and men too, were not necessarily they probably didn't even identify as witches, but a lot of who they were lower class healers and medicine people and folks who were serving the community in ways that were deemed not right by the Catholic Church at the time. And were possibly taking away power and taking away authority as well from the Catholic Church, that was hoping to make folks believe that the Catholic Church was the only authority and whatever that they religiously believed was the correct way of being. And that's kind of the gist of the accounts of those witch hunts during that time period. So most of these people probably didn't even identify as witches or necessarily practice witchcraft, but that is kind of what happened. And as a result of these witch hunts, a lot of folks who were traditional healers, traditional medicine folks, midwives, health workers of the time, a lot of those women and men of the time were pushed out of their work, were pushed out of where they were living at times, were persecuted, and soon to be disbelieved by a large amount of society, which is still a narrative that kind of remains prevalent today. So that's a little bit about that. Moving forward and focusing more on the American witch hunts, I guess, as we want to call them. Those happened shortly after the whole witch craze that happened in Europe. So it was assumed that they started in the 1650s or so to about like the 1700s. It was a little bit shorter. And that includes the Salem witch trials that happened in 1693, which were just a mess. Were just a big hoax essentially. But so I can talk a little bit about that. And I also want to mention that throughout the accounts that I'm talking about, I'm going to be focusing mostly on American history of the idea of a witch, witches and similar folks have been existing for a really long time in almost every culture across the world. Since the two accounts that I'm talking about are more focused on Europe and the US, I will be talking about that as well, as because that's my lineage as well, and I don't have the ownership or the identity to really be talking about the history and the meaning of some of the other cultures around the world that also have folks who do have a similar spirituality or also work as healers and medicine folks in their communities, but those are definitely something that have been long existing and are just as important. And so I would definitely encourage folks to find those resources. I can try to post some that I have also heard of other folks sharing. I can try to share those if people are interested, but just wanted to state that too, that I probably won't be talking about that as much and just be focusing mostly on what kind of the witch archetype has looked like in the US mostly. Continuing, so talking about the Salem witch trials. The Salem witch trials and most of the witch hunts that happened in the US during that time were stemmed from teachings of Christianity at the time that were really focused on the devil possessing people and making them do things that weren't good, spewing things that were lewd or obscene, or considered evil. Because of the witch craze, there was a lot of focus in different communities that were in the colonies in the US about witches possessing people, making them do things that they didn't want to do. A lot of accounts have been focused on alleged witches possessing children particularly, and the children not really knowing what they're doing, and the parents of the children being convinced that their child was possessed by the devil or by someone doing the devil's work. There's a lot of accounts throughout Europe and the US of depicting witches as making pacts with the devil, doing sexual acts with the devil, and oftentimes in all of these narratives, the art and the writing of the accounts of witches really shows the witch either being this really like dark, ugly old woman that is seeking youth and seeking power and is making pacts with the devil, or it's shown as this lewd, naked, young, temptress woman who is evil and trying to tempt men and children and whatnot to do the devil's bidding. And so that's kind of what the archetype during this time looked like, which is really gross. And yeah, really misogynistic, but that's kind of overall what this image of the witch was during that time. And so that's what's going on during the Salem witch trials. And essentially what pretty much happened in the Salem witch trials specifically is there was, I think, a niece of a reverend who was having fits and seemed possessed, and the townspeople and the parents couldn't figure out why. It continued with, I think, 2 other girls at the time, and these young women accused some other older women who were considered, I believe, outcasts of the town. They accused them to be witches and saying that they were doing their bidding and that they were being controlled by them, which led to essentially all the townspeople accusing each other of being witches and essentially lying. And in the end of the day, I think there was about 20 people executed and 200 people who were interrogated for being witches, and ended up being that everyone pretty much confessed that it was a big hoax, and that none of them actually knew if those folks were witches, and a lot of it was just manipulation and power dynamics and people wanting to spite their neighbors who they were not pleased with. And yeah, it wasn't great. And so a lot of the witch hunts throughout the US were very similar to the Salem witch trials, but obviously the Salem witch trials is the most notable of that time. Obviously, if you've watched The Crucible, you can kind of see that story play out. Obviously, it's been spun a little bit differently in The Crucible, which Pam Grossman talks about in her book. So I would definitely check out that part of the book if you're interested in learning more about that. But yeah, so that's kind of the older history of the witch hunts that happened. Witch hunts and the idea of witch hunts have obviously been continued throughout history. Some argue, and also in Waking the Witch, it's talked about how the Red Scare that happened in the early 1920s because of communism and the fear of communism, where people were interrogated if they seemed like they were supporting a communist party or anything aside from what the government was trying to promote at the time. There's a lot of folks who were interrogated and a lot of people who were sold out by their neighbors or falsely accused of supporting communism. And that's considered kind of a more modern witch hunt of that time, as well as what we hear with the term witch hunts today, with our with a disgusting president who's in office at the moment, talking about witch hunts as well. So this term has continued throughout history, obviously, in multiple ways.
The 1900s.
So, moving on, after the 1700s, there wasn't much necessarily action surrounding witches. It wasn't until I believe the late 1800s, early 1900s that we started to see depictions of witches again in popular media. We started to see witches being depicted in films and books. Most of the time still being portrayed as a villain or a temptress, or someone who had powers that was misusing them. And as Pam Grossman talks about in Waking the Witch, it wasn't really until The Wizard of Oz that we saw somebody who was a good witch, Glenda the Good Witch. And it was one of the first depictions of, a witch being able to be good and helping others, and also depicting that there's bad witches and good witches and this dynamic between the two. And that's something that's really interesting as well. And there's a lot of really interesting things actually about the author of The Wizard of Oz and his relation to his stepmother, who was part of a spiritualist community. And that's, something that's also in Waking the Witch that I would definitely recommend checking out. That's really fascinating. But But yeah, so The Wizard of Oz, we start seeing more of these depictions in kind of I think the movie came out in 1939. We start seeing more of these depictions of possibly good witches. And there's other films as well that kind of start portraying them as maybe a little bit more, if it's going to be black and white, maybe more on like the good side instead of the bad side. Yeah, so that's kind of how historically it started evolving. And then I'm going to jump forward a lot to the kind of more 1960s, 1970s. The witch archetype changes a lot. We have the creation of Wicca, which is a spirituality that is kind of termed to be started by Gerald Gardner, who kind of brought it to the US and wanted a more kind of nature-based spirituality. Wicca is now really associated with environmentalism and a spirituality that's more centered around the earth. A lot of people who practice Wicca are more associated with feminism and with empowering women. And so we see, in the 1960s and 70s, we see this resurgence of the identity of witches in being associated with more feminist movements, more political movements, a lot of folks that are focused on environmental rights and rights for women. One of my favorite groups that I love talking about, that Pam Grossman talks about in her book, is the group WITCH as an acronym, which originally stood as Women's International Terrorist Conspiracy from Hell. And they were a political group that was amazing, who would kind of combine comedy with their political activism. They would dress like witches. One of their notorious accounts that Pam Grossman talks about is their hexing Wall Street, in which they performed a ritual on Wall Street, and the next day the stock market dropped, I believe, like 4 or 5 points, and and it was said to be because of their hex that they performed on it. They also protested and performed other spells and rituals outside of other events, and they were large protesters of things that were perceived to be overly capitalistic, that were monopolizing the wedding industry and other corrupt political decisions that were made at the time. So in the 60s and 70s, we see, as I mentioned, this resurgence of witches and witchcraft and spiritualities that are connected to nature, are connected to political movements, are connected to the empowerment of women and feminism at the time, which really started to bring to life the idea of spells and rituals and witchcraft as this spirituality in the US at the time, which leads us then, moving to like the 80s and 90s, we start seeing television shows like Charmed, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Sabrina, movies like Practical Magic and The Craft at the time, that have these plots of women who most of them are doing magic in the ordinary world. We see a lot more focus on female empowerment during the time, and how to fight evil with your magic but not use it to benefit you for good, and all of these different narratives at the time. Just as we're having also outside of these movies and TV shows in the 80s and 90s, we're still seeing this growth of spirituality that was recreated in the 60s and 70s, and we start seeing more people identifying with paganism and Wicca and different spiritualities that either stem from those or are unique in their own. We start to see some of these spiritualities not only be unique and more independent from organized religion, but also see them being tied to things that have political agendas and are focused on empowerment in different ways. Yeah.
Modern day.
So, talking about modern day witches and witchcraft, it can look like so many different things today. Folks who identify as witches might identify as witches for a large variety of reasons. Some people identify with the word witch as a power term, as being a term of female empowerment in the world and fighting against the patriarchy and misogyny, and depicting the witch as a person that holds a lot of power and magic and belief and empowerment in herself. A lot of other folks who identify as witches might actually be might practice a specific witchcraft or a specific spirituality. They could identify as pagan. They could identify as druid. They could be Dianic witches. There's a lot of different groups out there that I'm not particularly super well versed in, but if that's something that is of interest to you, there's a lot of different places within the Twin Cities here and within the nation that are groups and teachers and events that are focused on different groups of focus that might identify as witches. And obviously not every single person who is pagan might identify as a witch also. So it's a really complex identity today and has been for a long time. And there's also witches who might really enjoy the term. It might be more, might enjoy the term for being more of their own independent solitary practice, and really enjoy the idea of being a witch as being completely outside from any sort of organized group or religion, and really just enjoy the independent aspect of it and the ability to not necessarily cater your spirituality, but act in the ways that feel most comfortable to you, and almost like a create your own spirituality type mindset. And then there's a lot of people who are attached to it for more social justice reasons and political movement reasons. And there's a lot of people who just find a lot of meaning with that term. And it could stem from the political climate we see today. I know a lot of folks who whose mothers or grandparents or someone in their lineage was identified as a witch or had a witch type spirituality, who still wants to continue that lineage and practice it today. There are folks like that as well. So being a modern day witch can look like a lot of different things, and it's actually really cool to see how it has changed over the course of history and how there's still a lot of archetypes that remain the same. It's really interesting when we talk about being a witch. We still have a lot of folks who are really fearful of that term and find it to be something that's threatening. Which I attribute to the history of witches. I also attribute it to the way that women have been perceived, and that it appears that like most women who identify as witches, I feel like, are perceived as threatening patriarchy and threatening the powers that be, and are not folks that are willing to just sit with things and let things be and not challenge them. So it's really interesting. I feel like when I introduce myself as a witch, there's still that connotation of being a threat or being bad, being malicious. Instead of, I think, what a lot of folks today who identify as witches feel like they're bringers of good, and that they're fighters for justice and equality, and trying to bring more understanding and more connection to nature and connection to each other into the world. So it's really interesting to see how the term witch still exists as that today, which is also kind of a cool aspect of it as well. I think that I can speak for myself. It feels really great to use that term in front of a cis straight white man and say I'm a witch and have them be freaked the fuck out. There's a really great shock factor in that, and a great source of empowerment, I find, using that term. So I think that's also like a large reason why folks are using that today. I think in light, and Pam Grossman talks about this in Waking the Witch, in light of the Me Too movement, we see a lot more folks who find a source of strength in being or identifying as a witch as well. And And we see the term come up a lot more, and we have the person in office using the term witch hunt, as I mentioned before, and how that just really creates a climate of having more people identified as witches today, it seems like. Yeah. And so, I mean, something also that I want to talk about, folks I know have asked me, like, what do you mean you're a witch, or why are you a witch, and what does that look like? What does that mean to you? And I would like to say, I mean, it's really similar to a lot of the things I just mentioned for modern day witches. You know, I have a lot of my own history with more organized religion and Christianity, and have a complicated relationship with such. And part of me really enjoys that being a witch allows me to really come into myself with not feeling conflicted with certain values or powers that be within organized religion that sometimes feel like they don't reflect my identity as being a woman, or being queer, or being genderqueer. And I think that there is a lot of freedom and individuality that you can play with in witchcraft. And you can really create something that speaks to you spiritually. And it's really cool when you meet other people who identify as witches, how diverse your practices might be, or how you both might find meaning in witchcraft completely differently, and how beautiful that is. I also identify as a nature-based spirituality. I find the connection to the environment really important, since it really is the foundation of our lives. And as, an empowering term of being a witch in today's society, and kind of, saying fuck it all to what exists today. Fuck capitalism, fuck corrupt political powers, fuck homophobia, transphobia, misogyny, all of those things. I feel like being a witch allows me to embrace an identity that allows me to challenge those systems and those narratives, and is... it feels very connected to me. It's one of, I've always been a more spiritual person, without having necessarily something that felt like a term to use that really felt like me. The term witch really resonates with me, and I think there's a lot of people who feel that way too, for maybe different reasons. And with modern witchcraft today, we see a lot more people identifying as witches because they are really interested in using that term in their spirituality as a tool of change for social justice and helping more marginalized communities in the world, and realizing that so many witches have historically always been part of marginalized societies. If you think back to the witch hunts, so many of those people were people who might have been lower class and healers that were pushed to the side and not listened to, and not given the authority and power that they deserved. So that's something that I really hold in my heart as well, even if it's not maybe my ancestral lineage. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a brief history of witches and the archetype. And if you have any more questions, feel free to reach out. I would definitely read the books that I recommended. My accounts are definitely not the most historically accurate, but it's kind of what I've learned thus far. And if you have more questions about my particular practice and what I do as a witch, feel free to reach out as well. And I hope to be sharing these things more often. Thanks!